You can.
I will start the roll call this morning. Amy Augustine. Teddy McKelly.
Here.
Teddy is here. Bruce Crane.
Here.
Bruce Crane is here. Steve Fensky.
Good morning.
Steve Fensky is here. Gail Hedstrom.
Present.
Gail Hedstrom is present. Brian Hood.
Here.
Brian Hood is here. Adam Hutchins.
Here.
Adam Hutchins is here. Mark Johnson.
Here.
Mark Johnson is here. Daniel Lightfoot. Paul McDonald.
Here.
Paul McDonald is here. Brianna Mummy.
Present.
Brianna is here. Phil Stahlberger.
Guilty and here.
Phil Stahlberger is here. John Twice. Just in time.
John Twist is here.
John Twice is here. Daniel Lightfoot.
Present.
Daniel Lightfoot is here. David Wolf. Melissa Wolf.
Here.
Melissa Wolf is here.
Okay, looks like we have a quorum, and so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our second meeting of the year. This will be a good meeting, and I know we have a superintendent here that will say a few words, so maybe we'll turn it over there. And
Superintendent, I'm flattered. I'm flattered. Go, Joe.
just like you.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you. Not quite the superintendent, but I'll take that, I guess.
There you go.
Sean Kunke here. I am the high school principal, activities director, and head football coach on the side. I do that every once in a while. But I appreciate the opportunity to welcome all of you here to Bram School. I would have to make a comment. We're very appreciative of Mark Johnson and his crew being right here and stationed right here in Bram Schools. We feel very fortunate to have him and his staff here as well. So I would like to welcome you to Bram School. I'm not sure if you've got the full intro of if you need to use the restrooms right across the hall main office. If there's anything else that we can get for you to provide your stay and welcome you, just let me know. Just as long as it doesn't cost anything or there's no money involved. We are a small rural school, so we do have those constraints as well. But again, we'd just like to welcome you to Bram, and hopefully you have a great stay.
Great. All right. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
And he's a dang good football.
Pretty dang good official here too, by the way.
I see the connection. All right, well, good introduction. Again, Mark, thank you for organizing this and hosting us here. I think one of the things we try to do in the task force is try to visit different parts of Minnesota and even the different constituents that are on the task force and kind of give us a little bit of an insight of why we do this and why it matters. So I'm excited that we are here at the school today. I mean, this is one we've been thinking about for quite some time, and we're able to pull it off, and I appreciate everybody that was able to make the trip here. But also welcome to the ones virtually, and let's go ahead and get started. So the agenda for today, we'll do a minute approvals. That's one thing we didn't do last meeting, so we'll have to do 2 meeting approvals. We'll do that in a second. From that, Mark will give us a little bit of an intro, sort of the cooperative benefits and some of the work he does and some of the challenges students and families face today, particularly with respect to broadband and the use of broadband. Bree was not able to make it today. She had a commitment she couldn't get out of. So Diane's going to give us an update on BEAD and what's happening there. Hannah will give us an update on the digital opportunity as she's done in the past. That should take us right about to the top of the hour at 11 a.m. We'll take a break at that point. And again, the schedule will be a little bit flexible. And then from that, again, we'll get into broadband overview as Bree usually does that. But again, Diane will do that in her place today. And then we'll have Dennis Rice, who's the broadband manager for East Central Energy here. He'll give us the benefits of the border-to-border grant programs and the ECE deployment. So that will be an interesting discussion. And then we'll end with just the subgroups. I appreciate everybody sending in your preferences. I try to get all the references right. We'll flash that up, make sure if we need to make some adjustments, we can, based on some of the assumptions. But, and then obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about what the subgroups are, what's the expectation, and what you can see from here. With that, we'll end with any public comments or any other business, and we'll close out the day, and we have a whole meeting for today. Okay, so with that, one thing is approval of the minutes. Those were included in the meeting invite, and Carol had sent them out as well. Like I said, we didn't do the approval for the September 19th meeting, so today we'll do a review of, I'll ask if anybody had any questions or concerns or issues with the September 19th and the November 30th minutes.
Do you want to do approval as a single motion for those?
Well, we haven't done motions and approvals.
Oh, we don't, okay.
We can start, but like,
We don't need
yeah,
that.
so and unless anybody has any concerns, you can voice them, but I don't see anybody saying anything, so we can move on. So with that, Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Appreciate it. I have some slides if Carol's able to throw those up, just something to look at and follow along, so you don't have to pay attention to me the whole time. Yeah, thank you for coming. The last time we were going to host it here was the March of 2020 meeting. You all know what happened then and why we didn't have that meeting here. We were planning to do it then, right? It didn't end up working out. So thank you for coming today. Just a couple things. I'm going to talk, talk a little bit about what our cooperative, the organization that I direct, and by the way, I'm the director of the Central Minnesota Educational Cable Cooperative, which you'll understand why it's named that in a moment, but we call it ECMEC. And then you can jump to the next one when you're ready. So our cooperative, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, right? It's also the land of 10,000 school cooperatives. There are oodles and oodles of them in the state. There are service cooperatives that were established by the legislature in the 60s that sort of work with MDE and the things that they try to do on a statewide level. There are like 8 or 9 of those in the state. But then there are there's special education cooperatives. There are telecommunications cooperatives like ECMEC. There are adult education cooperatives. There are technical cooperatives. There are just a ton of them, right? We all do different things and different services for our member districts. So ECMEC started in 1983 as an experimental ITV, interactive television cooperative. And so we had 6 members at the time, and we did 2-way. We're called we have cable in our name because at the time we were a partnership with the local cable franchise company, and we established essentially studios, cable TV studios in 6 high schools, and then they shared classes back and forth. So you had a teacher in one school, and you had remote students in 2 or 3 or whatever other schools. And we had cable channels. So if you were part of the public and you had cable TV, you could tune into German and learn. Nobody really did that. Although some people did, because we did find out once in a while someone from the public would call the school and say, "Did you know that a student is doing whatever?" You go, "How did you know?" Well, they were watching it. So that's how we started. That's why we have that in our name. So I had to say that because there'll be a quiz later. But anyway. So that was a long time ago. Fun fact, 1984, 83, 84 was the first year that ECMEC did ITV classes, and I was a student in Princeton, Minnesota in an ECMEC ITV class. So I started with the cooperative way back when. Little did I know that I'd be part of it now. So anyway.
So you were in the classroom, like you're watching?
I was a student in the classroom, yeah. We happened to have the host, we were the host, so we had the teacher in our classroom, but we had students in 2 other classrooms who were just sitting in there and getting instruction.
They would watch the TV and then.
But we could hear them and see them, and it was interactive, and we still do that in a different way now, but we still do that. So if anybody that's present is interested in seeing that, we can show that to you after the meeting. But that's how we started. Now we're 14 school districts, and we have a higher education partner, Pine Technical and Community College, part of the Minnesota State College University system. We break our services down into 3 or 4 buckets. We do educational opportunities, which is distance learning, our ITV, both hybrid and fully synchronous, two-way interactive classes. We still do that. We have a number of career academies that are a partnership with Pine Technical and Community College. So students in our districts can, from their own school, participate in a number of career academies, medical careers, IT careers, business, early childhood education, a couple of others as well. So those are things that we help facilitate. We do classroom technology, so a lot of professional development for teachers around education technology. We run a conference in the summer, we call it Lake ECMEC, dip your toes in technology is our tagline with that. Even before COVID, we were streaming events for districts, but once the pandemic hit, we ratcheted that up big time. And now districts are finding, we're helping districts find their own ways to do that, things like that. We have our network and information security area, which I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. So I'll talk about some of those things. And then we do some advocacy, certainly around school funding and education technology funding. But for the last decade plus, we've been very much advocates for broadband and working with the various counties in the area. Pine, Kennebec, Isanti, and many others. So that advocacy is a piece of what we do as well. And there are lots of other cooperatives like us, and I'll get to that in a moment. So we'll go to the next slide. One of the things we do around broadband is our data network. And I now say we have a 1 to 2 gigabit per second fiber wide area network that connects all 14 of our districts. 2 other cooperatives, as I said, we have 2 special education cooperatives and a regional library system, East Central Regional Library System, also in a way part of that network as well. And we have a hub at Pine Tech and Community College, and the picture in the upper right is the data center at Pine Tech where we bring in all of our districts together. And then that was started in 2006 with a partnership with the local cable television. At the time was US Cable. Which has now become Midco. But in 2006, our districts had gigabit access. That was unheard of in 2006. And I will tell you, it took until this year for any of our districts to need to reach beyond that. And for the first time this year, we have 2 of our districts that have moved to a 2 gigabit connection so that our districts are relatively small. We start with 300-400 students, K-12 in Ogilvie and Isle, and we go up to 6,000 or so in Cambridge, Isanti, and then Elk River is a partner but not a full member, and they're certainly 14,000 students. So we run the gamut in terms of the number of students that we serve. Our data center is co-located with Pine Tech. We have a cloud there, an intermediate cloud. So we have a virtual infrastructure that many of our districts, in fact, all of our districts participate in. And we do an enterprise level firewall there. We do a lot of security services that we attach to that. We utilize Minnesota IT Services, so Minute, as our service provider. So out of Pine Tech and Community College, we aggregate all of our districts together. We buy bandwidth in the internet from Minute and go out network that way. And you can go to the next one. I probably won't need one for 20 minutes, we'll see. But the stretching it out, so now that's a little bit about what ECMEC does for our 14 districts, and we have this wide area network. Then in central Minnesota, there is a wide area network for internet service that has existed for some 20 years. Just this year, ECMEC took over management of that network, and that connects over 60 school districts, which is pretty close to 20%, about 18% of the public school districts in Minnesota are connected to that wide area network for internet service. Plus we have 46 library sites that are part of that as well. And that has, again, existed for over 20 years. We're now managing that. That also utilizes Minnesota IT Services, Minute, as the service provider for that group of schools. Now, we do that on behalf of those districts. There are other cooperatives. Some of you familiar with other cooperatives in the area, like Northeast Service Cooperative or West Central Service Cooperative, which also, or Northwest Links in the northwest part of the state, are 3 other very large networks. I would say together between those 3 and Central, the Central WAN, that's probably getting close to 40% or 50% of the school districts in Minnesota that are managed by those cooperatives in terms of their broadband access and their network access. What that does is that allows us to do a number of things. We capture federal E-rate funding to help pay for it. We also capture state telecommunications equity aid to help pay for that service. For in our central MinWAN, and this is pretty common across the others, we have full gigabit bandwidth available or more, I should have said that, or more, available to every entity. But overall, we aggregate the access. So when we buy, so we have circuits that go to all these districts at this speed, but not all of them use a gigabit of service all the time, right? Some, they peak, and right, you know how that works. So then we aggregate that, we buy the amount of bandwidth we need to cover it all in an aggregated kind of a way, which drives that cost down considerably, actually, over every district having to buy what they might need for 30 minutes out of the day, right? This way, when we aggregate it, it kind of makes a big difference. So the state of Minnesota is our internet service provider for that. And we have various hubs that are part of the state of Minnesota network. Other Northeast Service Cooperative, Northwest Links, they do it similar way. They don't necessarily use Minute as their provider, but they use other providers to help with that. So,
some of the work from, like,
yes.
let's say the state of Minnesota does some of the groundwork. Is it the school, the ECMEC's responsibility to get it to the various schools, or does it help with that?
So it's done in both ways. In ECMEC, we have our own contract for circuits, for transport.
Yeah.
So as a group, because we want that hub at Pine Tech and Community College so we can do these other services. So we procure our own, we have a contract, in our case it's with Midco, local service provider, to get to the hub, and then we get Minute's internet service and management service from there. Now, in other cases, like in other parts of the central Min network that's not ECMEC, then Minute procures circuits from other providers, as part of that contract. So, but Minute owns very little actual fiber. They lease most of it from local providers. Yeah. So that's a good point on how that works.
Is your build out of the infrastructure that you utilize to service the network a part of a cable franchise agreement?
Back in 2006, it was a kind of a groundbreaking agreement, yes. And that was how they built it. Because we were sort of an anchor on that, it's how the cable company built. And it was done somewhat through the cable franchise process, yeah.
And you require.
I don't know if listen, I'll know anything about it or not, but because.
Well, I just think it's an important piece of this because I think, one of the critical parts of cable franchising is to ensure build outs to certain areas that wouldn't probably normally be built out without one. And I think, this task force should consider, that type of model to ensure build out from providers that aren't necessarily cable providers to areas that need the service. And I think the only reason we have, fiber and reliable wireline broadband internet service in many of these areas, especially in this part of the state and elsewhere, is because of the cable franchise agreement that require build out to those areas and institutional networks, et cetera.
And thank you for pointing that out, because I kind of ran over that faster than I should have, because I totally agree. I think in 2006, when we did that agreement, that transformed the services that the cable company at the time could provide to our communities out here in this area. Now, unfortunately, or however circumstances were, that didn't get into the rural outside of the towns, but the towns, the cities, and so on, had that service really because we were able to broker that agreement and work with the communities that franchise it to make it work. I mean, it wasn't cheap, right? So we also had federal E-rate dollars to help subsidize it too, which made it. And I credit the people at the time, and Steve Allen was the director of ECMEC at the time, and the counties and the cities that were part of that at the time, the vision that they had to do it. And that happened in some other parts of the state too. I mean, Northeast Service Cooperative used way back at ARPA, back in the day, funding to build a network up there. So yeah, that's part of my thing is the cooperative. I'm a cooperative minded person, and I think that has done a lot to bring service to rural parts of town, but we need rural parts of the state. And now we're working, of course, on getting it to the really rural outside the cities. Sure. So thanks for pointing that out. So, and this kind of builds on that. So you go from ECMEC and what we do to these larger networks, and then you go to the Minnesota Education Technology Networks, which is METN, which is a very loose organization of cooperatives, right? So it's people like me in other parts of the state that we get together and try to cooperate on how we do things at a statewide level. So these cooperatives that do broadband and provide telecommunication services cover nearly 90% of Minnesota public school districts. And you can kind of see that map shows where some of these cooperatives are and what their names are. They're established either through statute or through joint powers agreements. Many of them are joint powers agreements. And they're funded, or we're funded through, for broadband especially, through E-rate, federal funding, and through state telecommunications aid, and then our own members, right? So there's a mix of how we're funded. But I take this opportunity to say that's one of the reasons, and I might bring this up again later, but as broadband development has happened, one of the reasons that schools haven't been able to play a larger role, you always talk about anchor tenants, right? And you want the school to be an anchor tenant. The problem is we have a lot of rules that we have to follow with the federal E-rate funding. And that federal E-rate funding represents 50 to 80%, depending on your district and your poverty, kind of your district NLSP, National School, NSLP, National School Lunch Program numbers. Anywhere between 50 and 80% of the cost. And that's tough to turn that down unless you get a deal that's just as good from, to be an anchor tenant with a provider. We did that in 2006. And we bit the bullet then and paid, a lot of money to do it. But that is why sometimes schools aren't as eager, aren't as available or able to be an anchor tenant on a new deployment or a new network in a community, because they're already served probably by a provider and they're already getting a subsidy, and there's a whole set of rules you have to follow, bidding, competitive bidding and so on, rules that you have to follow to get that E-rate funding. And then the state funding is only comes to you if you get the federal funding first. So that whole cascade makes it really difficult. So I want to point that out because, again, we want to be part of, and I'll tell you in a little bit how we are part of all of our communities and what we're doing for broadband, but we have limits sometimes in what we can do because of rules. Schools have lots of rules they have to follow. Y'all learned that in school, right? The rules. So, anyway, so the METN represents all these different cooperatives. Most of them provide internet. There's, as you saw, ECMEC provides other services too, but we're kind of focused on the broadband piece here. But then the schools are very involved in the digital equity piece, and that's one area where schools can be great partners as we move forward in that area. Because every school district has community education, and community education classes have been done in lots of areas to help people adopt technology, whether it's populations that don't normally have access to it. School districts can do advocacy, and METN does advocacy in a big way around broadband. We did well before the pandemic. I know we and a couple of other cooperatives were working with the Blandin Foundation on broadband guides and using the mapping and so on, and providing our schools with guides that they could give, and they gave them out at conferences, and they had them in counseling offices and so on, that they could provide to people that said, here's what's available. Maybe it's not great, but here's what's available, and try to make sure that people can understand what they have for it. Cooperatives and school districts in general are very good about making sure their counseling offices have information about affordability programs, whether it was Lifeline at the one time, or whether it's the ACP program or whatever. making sure that they have the information they need to provide, because the counseling offices are sometimes the ones that see the students who are at greatest need, and the families who have the greatest need for this. And during the pandemic, that was heightened. I mean, we went into full gear, provide everybody with every potential opportunity they have, and by getting hotspots to get out to students who needed them and all of those kinds of things. And that was all done, really all done through schools and libraries. And we have a lot of connection with libraries, especially in our area, and I don't think that's unusual in other parts of the state necessarily either, where we work with them. When the Partnership for Connected Minnesota did some grant making, there were several cooperative parts that were cooperatives that were part of METN that applied for grants to get devices to provide to students, or hotspots to help provide students. Or in the case of ECMEC, we did a digital navigation project so that every one of our districts had a digital navigator who learned about how to help families get access during the pandemic and beyond. And so those were things that we did as well in the digital equity world. And again, that's an area where schools can provide a lot of opportunity and work with other organizations. Now, take the metro area, there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that do that kind of thing. You get out of the metro, those don't exist in the same way. So schools and libraries tend to take over, in some respect, fill that niche, or fill that opportunity. So, and then finally, need to go to the last one, if I can find my slide here. So, what's the landscape and what are the challenges? Nearly all schools in Minnesota are connected via fiber. I don't think it's reached the Angle Inlet School yet. That was one of the last ones, and there are a few that still utilize fixed wireless, like maybe to a remote elementary school or to a, but most every district at least has fiber into the district, and then sometimes how they get it to the buildings is a little bit different. And most of them have the bandwidth they need to fully utilize technology for whatever purpose they want to use it for. That's not generally a problem in schools, in school buildings. As I mentioned before, federal rules limit district involvement in community networks, just so that the task force and others are aware that that's a constraint that we sometimes run into. But we try to find every opportunity to partner that we can. Many have one-to-one device programs, especially since the pandemic. But this introduces one of the challenges. We're very wary of what we call the fiscal cliff, which is the fact that there was a lot of federal money available and state money and other, to procure these devices and grant money and so on, to do a one-to-one program within the schools. And now students are very used to it. Families are used to having that access, et cetera, et cetera. Those devices don't last forever. And so now we're looking at that's the fiscal cliff. How do you afford to continue that without all of those other funding mechanisms that existed? We certainly experience digital haves and have-nots still, right? And the task force is well aware of that. But that's, we are keenly aware of that because we have families in the rural areas that don't have any access. We still issue hotspots. Libraries still issue hotspots to families. And then again, you all know about that. Some rural communities still without high-speed access. That again in 2006 when we signed the agreement, that brought that opportunity to our communities, but it didn't reach necessarily the rural areas, especially now with the cable franchise. And families still struggle with affordable service. We hear that all the time, and our counselors again are letting people know about the opportunities that exist and our providers that provide those services, those reduced price services. But that is still a struggle that schools face. So that's all I've got. That's a little update on how things look at schools, and you get an idea of how we do things. Hopefully that was educational. Any questions?
Questions from Mark? I have one question for you. So obviously the pandemic shed a whole light, right?
Yeah.
You need to have it now just to go to school. It wasn't just to do homework, right?
Absolutely.
And a lot of teachers and the education system sort of adapted like a digital methodology, maybe more so than they did before. And now that they're back in school, though, are there still things that they started to do that require more use of broadband than there was before the pandemic?
Yes, I would say yes, there are. I think, there was that, when people came back to school, there was that pullback to, oh my gosh, we're back together and we can actually do things, right?
Yeah.
So there was that, but you will see the use, I'll give you an example. For example, learning management systems. So these are the way in which students would log in to interact with a teacher, whether by chat or by video or whatever, and to get assignments and things like that. Before the pandemic, there were learning management systems, but they were, more sparsely used, not as prevalent. And now I don't think in virtually any school a day goes by when students aren't accessing that learning management system, whether it's even in school or out of school. And so that way of communicating with students and parents and providing, content that they can access, and has definitely stayed. That's definitely an area that
Which contributes to the haves and have-nots.
which contributes to that problem. Correct. Yeah. And that's one of the struggles that certain school districts face. Yeah.
Are there things that schools would want to do more of? If, like, let's say, if there was a wish, every student would have access, right? But that's not the case. Are there things that schools would want to do that's preventing them from doing that because of that issue?
I think what I hear is really that communication piece that is so electronic now and so ingrained in having access that the districts that have a large number of families that can't access that way would definitely like them to. I mean, that's a huge part. So I think communication is the biggest part right now.
And I'm guessing communication to the parents as well.
Correct. That's more so, right? More so to the parents. Yeah, for sure. And getting them involved that way.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing. Any other questions or comments for Mark? Thanks for putting that together. I myself have more insight into this now, so it's really good. This is the point of having some of these presentations at the task force. Mark's been on it for a long time. We still hadn't talked about this because the presentation was supposed to be in March of
2020.
More relevant now, maybe. So, okay. So moving on to the next topic, it's beat update. So, Diane, do you want to come here? That way you can on camera too.
So do we have camera?
Well, there.
For those of you that don't know me, I'm Diane Wells, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Office of Broadband. I moved over to the office from the Minnesota Department of Commerce in 2013 when the office was first stood up. So I've been working on broadband for a number of years. Bree would have loved to join you. I don't know if she's still on the phone. The governor decided to do a broadband event down with BevCom in southern Minnesota, so she, of course, is with the governor. Sorry. Anyway, I will do a BEAD update, and then Hannah Buckland is here and she'll do a digital opportunity update. So my comments now are just going to be about the BEAD submission that Minnesota made to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, of the U.S. Department of Commerce. As you're probably all aware, Minnesota received or will receive about $652 million for broadband infrastructure funding. NTIA is the federal agency that's administering that funding, and so we have a number of reports that we have to file with them before we even see the money. We did a 5-year action plan that we submitted last July 12th, and then all of the states had the same deadline for their initial proposals because it was 180 days after the state allocations were made, which was late June last year, so they were all due December 27th. We submitted ours December 22nd. It did have a 30-day public comment period, and the proposal is called the initial proposal, and it was set up to be in a volume 1 and a volume 2. And so we did submit those on December 22nd. We did receive Monday night some initial curing requests from NTIA on volume 1, and so we are working on that. One of the areas that NTIA wants more information on is the community anchor institutions. If you're familiar with how the BEAD funding is to be distributed, The federal government has laid out 3 priorities for infrastructure. First is to get broadband service to all unserved locations. Second priority is to get service to all underserved locations. An unserved location is a location that does not have reliable broadband service of at least 25 megabits down and 3 meg. Somewhat from the state of Minnesota's definition, where eligibility for the grant program is based on a wired service. For federal purposes, reliable broadband service also includes broadband service delivered over licensed or licensed by rule fixed wireless service. So if you have reliable broadband service per that federal definition, at 25 by 3, but not at 100 by 20, then you're in that underserved category. If you have reliable broadband service under that federal definition at or above 100 meg down, 20 meg up, then you are considered served and you won't be eligible for BEAD funding. The third priority is to get gigabit symmetrical speeds to community anchor institutions. We do not believe, and we're in the process of issuing an RFP to have that document by a neutral third-party entity as to what it would cost to get service to all un- and underserved locations in Minnesota, but we're pretty certain it exceeds the $650 million. So we don't believe we'll have any money of that $652 million to get to community anchor institutions. So when I was meeting with NTIA yesterday, I was like, why do we have to go through all of this work to define, identify, and then list what the upload and download speeds are that are actually being delivered at all of these community anchor institutions, which is, by the way, pretty impossible to get. And they're like, we have to treat all the states the same. So we'll be doing the best we can to get more information on the community anchor institutions for our volume 1.
Can you give an example of what they are?
A community anchor institution, what we're seeing that don't have service right now are our township halls, township fire stations, but a community anchor institution could be a hospital, a police station, any of the municipal structures. I suppose it could be a lift station. I know we're seeing some of those coming with the line extension discussion with rural communities wanting to build lift stations. But so anything that would be serving the public. So and we had those. We had to do the same exercise with the ARA funding back in 2009 and 2010. So we already had them on the map. So what we had put in our BEAD volume 1 was if there are community anchors out there that are on the map, to let us know, and let us know what your speeds, where you are, what type of an anchor institution you are, what your speeds are. We really didn't. We got a list of tribal, one of the tribes sent a list. So, but that was about it. But they are on the map, and you can go on our map on the bottom left. There's, you can pull up and map out like a library with the schools, public, private, charters. They're on there, and we have really good data from that education superhighway exercise. 2015 anyway.
15, 16, yeah, somewhere around that.
So anyway, so we have good school data drawn from the E-rate information. Anyway, the other area that we're supposed to provide additional information is our request to classify all locations served by just that licensed or licensed by rural fixed wireless. We're trying to get that so it's the same as the state law, so they'd be eligible for BEAD funding. And what NTIA is looking for is specific state examples. So we had included an email that we received from one of the cable providers that does use licensed fixed wireless service that indicated, because we were hearing from consumers out in Minnesota saying, well, the map says they're there, but when I call them, they can't get service. And the response we got from that cable provider was, yeah, we recognize there's about 30% of people that, even though it shows we can get there, we can't. So that was Minnesota specific. And then we also had Connected Nation does a lot of our field validation. We had them go out and look at a few towers to see what was on the tower and to do a spectrum analysis of the service. and then look at what was being reported to the FCC on their map, and they found some discrepancies in terms of, yeah, what's up on that tower cannot possibly serve 100% of the customers, as that provider was showing. So, we provided some information. I'm hoping Connected Nation will have a little bit more information that we can include when we cure it and have some additional language. It does sound like, Vermont and Georgia are doing some work as well, and it does sound like some headway is being made in terms of getting the cellular wireless coverage ratcheted back and not considered as 100% coverage and served, and then therefore ineligible for BEAD. So we're still doing our best on that, because, gosh, people in Minnesota, they don't necessarily know what fixed wireless is, and they pretty much surely don't know whether it's coming over a licensed or licensed by rural spectrum. So we are doing our best to try to get those locations eligible for BEAD funding. But in the end, it's an NTIA decision, and they will tell us whether, after we make our case, whether it will be or not. At a minimum, we'd really like to flip the burden of proof. So it's not the end user that has to do 3 speed tests on a service that they might have to pay $100 or $150 to subscribe to just so they can run the speed tests, to give it to an entity that is actually allowed to challenge under the BEAD challenge process, which is a nonprofit, a local government, or a provider. So if we could just say they're not, and then have the provider come in and say, yes, I can get to this location, so that they have the burden of proof. Seems to make more sense to me, but anyway, that remains to be seen.
Can I ask, what kind of nonprofit could an end user go to? Like, is there a list of them that they can find online that they can submit their speed test to, or what kind of nonprofit are we thinking of?
I suppose it could be an economic development entity if they're a nonprofit. I think what we're really trying to do is work with townships and counties to see who has that big enough pool to really mount a challenge.
Okay.
And, the other issue with this whole thing, and I had that discussion yesterday too, was, well, you should be working with your counties and your townships. But the problem is, the areas most in need are also the most rural that really lack the capacity to do this. I mean, there are some reasons why we have counties that don't have good service. I mean, some have been trying, but
Oh,
some
no,
of them
this is,
have the capacity. So, anyway, the other areas that we are going to be doing some curing on is the list of un- and underserved locations. They want the date for the map. I mean, some of these are pretty easy for us to correct. Some confirmation that we are adopting the model language, because I had pulled it and then they changed it and updated it in late November, and I was working on that section in October. So anyway, so we'll get those. To date, Louisiana is the only state where both volumes 1 and 2 have been approved. Colorado, Delaware, Kansas, Montana, and Virginia have had their volume 1s approved. And so once you have your volume 1 approved and your volume 2 submitted, then you can start your BEAD challenge process. And so we are working with a vendor to help set up that challenge portal, so it will not be done within our office. We'll be having a vendor who can go in, citizens can take speed tests, and as soon as we have more information on how that can be done and the timing, which is, because we don't know when NTIA is going to approve all of this, we will do our best to let everyone know that it's up and, when it will be up and running and when you can start submitting speed tests, because it's not, it's 3 speed tests that have to come from the same location. So it's not just like take 1 speed test and you made your case as a citizen that you don't have service. It's a burden, it's a lift. Anyway, so that's kind of the update on where we're at with BEAD. I'm happy to take any questions.
How many comments did you get on the volumes 1 and 2 from the public?
I think, was it, was it like 140?
That's what I was thinking.
Okay.
44 or something.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Is there a place for us to go read those, or are they publicly available, or does that go to NTIA? Where did that end up?
The summary went to NTA. We didn't make them publicly available.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Again, I know there was a number of townships in my area of Minnesota, St. Louis County, very remote, topography, tree cover, you name it, had submitted some comments. I know on behalf of the county, St. Louis County, we also submitted some comments regarding being able to, we think that, you know, the wireline connections are the only way to go in spending, but we're in a position where just our location itself doesn't make it conducive to be able to do a lot of that other stuff. So I know there's some applications out there for some of these townships that are looking at that. So just wanted to make sure that everybody on the task force is aware of our concerns up in the northeast part of the state too. So.
And we have made the argument that we should be able to take that money and respond to the technology and the applications we receive. And if that uses up all the money, then we use it up. And NTIA is telling us we have to get something to everyone. So depending on how strictly they enforce that, if we get applications for fiber that maybe get to 50 or 60% of those unserved locations, we need to save enough money to use and give to fixed wireless providers to get to that last, so we can meet the federal requirement that we can say we got internet to all. And my response to that is Minnesotans generally want fiber. That's what we see in our application. So why put in something less? And in many cases, people have that already and they don't like it. You know, most people can get Starlink. I think there's very few people that couldn't get Starlink. So why, if we have to look at alternative technologies that have been built in the past without needing a government subsidy, why would we give them a government subsidy now? And for what?
Still provide a sub-tier technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Mr. Chair, if I could just follow up on that, and then just one, you know, from counties in general, you know, looking around, I know a number of people have asked about a possible one-pager from the office on walking them through some things of, you know, how to navigate this whole thing. Because, you know, when you have a clerk that comes in once or twice a month and tries to do some things, I don't know if we can get something from the office on that. That would be extremely beneficial to a lot of the counties that, in the townships that are served.
Yeah, when we did the township meetings, we had a few one-pagers that we prepared. So there is a PDF on our website for the line extension program, for example, that you can have available as a handout. And the line extension program, for those that aren't familiar, is if you are a resident or business and you don't have a wired broadband service at least 25 by 3, you can register in our portal. And then we pull those addresses about every 6 months and put them out for a reverse auction. And so to see if any provider will bid to serve, and then we can do a grant up to $25,000 per location.
Yeah,
And we have another one about what our office does, but that's a good idea for.
yeah, because as we look at counties and townships and partnerships and all this stuff, I mean, I think it would be very beneficial and ease the process for some of these people that get in a position and then they just go, oh, forget it.
Yeah, for sure, for
Yeah.
the challenge, the B
Correct.
challenge
Yeah.
process, yes.
So thank you for that. That's all I have.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Okay, thanks, Kate, for the break, opportunity.
Someone has a question.
Sorry, online.
There's a question.
Yes, this is Brianna.
Oh, Brianna, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. We all know obviously the challenge process is going to be super critical to identify what those un- and unserved areas are. The vendor you're working with, have they identified an outreach strategy? What does that look like and how long is the challenge process? Can you speak to that at all?
Sure, the vendor we're working with is, it's a company, FGO, it's owned by Sanford, I think it is. They're doing up to 10 other states challenge processes for feed. And so we haven't signed a contract with them, we're still working on the contract language. But the challenge, we're gonna adopt the challenge process, the model challenge process, so it'll last about 120 days. But yes, we've been in discussions with them about making sure you have lead time before it opens for people to be doing the speed tests and to be familiar with it and to, you know, publicize it so that it can add on to that 120-day period, so people have front end time to you know, go into the portal, look at it, do speed tests before the actual time starts to submit the challenges, which, like I said, the challenges actually have to be submitted by a nonprofit, a provider, or a local government.
Has NTIA released any resources to local units of government that could be key partners in the challenge process? I don't know if that's a question for you or NTIA, but I know that there was some conversations on getting out some specific information from the agency level so that local units of government have what they need to mount a batch challenge if needed.
I suspect that what the response from NTIA would be that's the state's responsibility.
I think that's a really important piece and would encourage the office, and I mean, I know counties are in the room too, and I certainly would be welcome and willing to assist with that. I just think, given what you said about how a lot of these communities that will have discrepancies that would warrant a challenge probably don't necessarily know about it yet.
Right, I mean, if you're an individual concerned about where you might land, you should be going on the FCC's map. And we do plan to do 4 or 5 communities around the state on the challenge process.
Would Adriana Thompson please come to the front office? Adriana Thompson, please come to the front office.
Speed is trouble. Yeah. I got one. So thinking about Commissioner McDonald's counties that have given comments, is there a way we could get a compiled list of all the comments about Volume 1 and Volume 2, either available to the public or available to the task force? It'd be interesting to read some of the comments that came in about them.
I can take that back. I know we were trying to do the same thing we did with digital opportunity comments.
Okay.
So it would probably be more of a joint decision about if we release one, we release the other.
Okay. Thanks.
Diane, what were the speeds for unserved?
If you're unserved, you would not have 25 megabit download, 3 megabit upload via reliable broadband service. And speed testing does that. I mean, you can't just take your Wi-Fi and just say, wow, what speed am I getting here? I mean, you're supposed to be plugged in to direct connection, not have anything else running in the household at the same time.
Which happens all the time.
Okay, other questions or comments? Thank you, Diane. Anna?
I always like going after Diane because it makes my work seem so simple. My name is Hannah Buckland. I'm the Digital Equity Program Lead with the Office of Broadband Development. So my focus is on the Federal Digital Equity Act funding that's coming to Minnesota. We first had a digital equity planning grant of $881,905.10. The plan that was produced using that funding was submitted to NTIA on November 21st. As promised, on December 1st, I vacated the state entirely and eventually came back, obviously. The plan that has been submitted to NTIA is not a final draft. As they're going through with the BEAD proposals too. The digital equity plan has received some recommendations from NTIA that we need to incorporate into this revised draft. We'll submit the revised draft by February 13th, and then that will kick off the final process of curing this plan. So we received comments from NTIA about the draft plan. The draft is what outlines how the state will eventually implement capacity grant funding to bring digital equity activities and opportunities throughout the state. This could relate to device access, to affordability, skills, some of the digital navigation work that Mark has been talking about. The comments we received from NTIA that we need to incorporate are largely focused on things that are more structural in nature. Make sure this is connected to this more clearly, connect this to this more clearly. The area I think that's proving to be more of a challenge is their comments having to do with the timeline proposed in the digital opportunity plan as it is. The comment we received is the implementation timeline is not realistic or achievable and does not include flexibility for potential delays, which I can agree with due to the fact that we still don't have a notice of funding opportunity from NTIA for the capacity grant, which will be used to implement the plan. So this is where we are. We have a draft plan. We have revisions planned. We are revising it. We'll submit it on or before, definitely actually, February 13th. And then we are still waiting to find out how much funding we get, the parameters of how we can use that funding. We don't know when we will find this out. So it's kind of a place of treading water. At the same time, NTIA is also working on the competitive grant notice of funding opportunities. Within the Digital Equity Act, there's the planning grants that states, tribes, and territories have, followed by capacity grants. And then separately from that, there are competitive grants that NTIA will administer at a national level for organizations to apply to. We've heard from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance that those competitive grants are expected to be really competitive and focused on funding amounts of at least $500,000. So small communities, rural communities, organizations with limited staff capacity are likely going to find that those competitive grants are not attainable, which means the state plans are even more essential in making sure rural and underrepresented communities have access to this funding. That's all I have for digital opportunity. I also included some ACP information, but if you have questions on digital opportunity, I can answer that first. Yes?
One question, is there anything regarding, that federal broadband assistance bill pay? Is there a chance for more money as we move, into equity? We talk about, Mark mentioned, people just can't afford it.
Yeah.
Is there, if it's not federal, would the state look at possibly doing something like this at some time? I'm just throwing it out there.
So the program at the federal level is the Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP. And right now, the future of ACP is pretty unknown. Chair Rosa Mersel at the FCC was saying that the funding for ACP could run out in April of this year. Currently, 22.5 million households nationwide use ACP to afford internet service, so it's pretty essential. There was a bipartisan bill introduced in the House and Senate and Congress yesterday that proposes an additional $7 billion added to the ACP program. This would theoretically bring the program through December of 2024, but it all depends on whether or not that passes. Once the state legislature is in session, we'll see if there's any state interest in complementing or supplementing this, but right now it's another case of everything is just unknown.
Makes sense.
Great mysteries, yeah. Are there any other questions?
Okay. Any other questions in the room? Nothing in virtual? Okay, thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so 11:02, it's time for our break. Let's get back together at 11:15.